but it's like, come on, take a moment, take a breather, like you said, and focus on what's actually happening, even though there's a lot of events that are going on. What's actually, how are you feeling comparing to, that baseline? And like I said, a lot of what recently over the past 2 or so years, as I'm more immersed in understanding mental health as an organizer, that we should be more so chasing satisfaction rather than just happiness. And I think a lot of times what happiness is really a fleeting moment that happens, brings a lot of a joy, a lot of, releasing those neurotransmitters. But as soon as it passes, you're back at that baseline. And it's like nothing even really happened.
Hey, welcome back to Normalize the Conversation. I am so excited for today's guest. We actually connected through the Florida Mental Health Advocacy Coalition. He is a mental health advocate, just a wonderful human being. Davy, thank you again so much for joining me today. How are you really?
How am I really? What a great question. To the classical opening that most people ask, and the typical response is, I'm doing good, I'm fine. And I love the way that you asked that, because really to address mental health concerns, illnesses, and issues is to understand how a person is doing outside of the basic facade that inevitably is always presented as a front to kind of conceal what is really happening, what's actually being experienced. So I appreciate that first question, breaking that surface level barrier. And I would say I am myself, I'm doing pretty well. Thankfully, a lot of the projects that I'm working on, both mental health and outside of that, are doing great in terms of hitting milestones that I've set when I started out. And I think a lot of times it's important for mental health to understand that you can have these projects and be very productive, but also be productive in being mindful of every moment that passes, as well as chasing avenues of approach that can bring satisfaction and happiness. Because if you're getting a lot of milestones done for projects, but internally as that happens, not feeling satisfied, then that in of itself is a major concern for mental health.
100%. I think it's so common that I know in my experience, I can say that for me, producing content and working really hard and just going and going and going often overshadows my mental health. And it can be so hard to recognize that it's okay to also take a break. It's okay to take a mental health day, a self care day. It's okay to take just a self care hour, just clearing your schedule for an hour and taking some time to kind of just focus on you and check in with yourself. Make sure that you are doing okay because your productivity is also going to be tied to your mental health. That was such an amazing point you brought up.
Yeah, and I also say, contrary to the common notion of productivity, even if you're just chilling there, sipping some tea, watching a favorite TV show, that is also productive because you're doing things that help the mind body connection continue to grow. But we're so immersed in this culture that's like, what is your hustle, your main hustle, your side hustle, what are you doing now, later, your side project, whatever you're working on now. But it's like, come on, take a moment, take a breather, like you said, and focus on what's actually happening, even though there's a lot of events that are going on. What's actually, how are you feeling comparing to, that baseline? And like I said, a lot of what recently over the past 2 or so years, as I'm more immersed in understanding mental health as an organizer, that we should be more so chasing satisfaction rather than just happiness. And I think a lot of times what happiness is really a fleeting moment that happens, brings a lot of a joy, a lot of, releasing those neurotransmitters. But as soon as it passes, you're back at that baseline. And it's like nothing even really happened. And so satisfaction really is what, I try to chase, practice what I preach. And satisfaction is where finding not only happiness, but also experiences, good or bad, that serve as monumental building blocks that can be looked on and explored later on and look back and say, I've gone this far because I built up this satisfaction over time. Because happiness just happens, it happens, and it when it's gone, it's often very easily forgotten and not recalled again. But satisfaction and being resilient, the good moments can be, look, I did something great, a short while back. Therefore I can do something even better. In addition to that, the not so great moments can be looked at as, learning experiences, because something that could have been negative might in the long term actually be a very productive experience in learning and building upon and figuring out what is the best route for whatever project that is being worked on.
Exactly. And I really want to go back to something you said in the beginning as the productivity and how much we do and how many roles we can take on. That is something that is so ingrained into our society. I can't tell you guys how many times I will be sitting somewhere, people ask what I do, and I'll talk about how I'm a full-time student, how I'm running this nonprofit, writing books, speaking engagements, and they'll be like, oh, but do you have a full-time job as well? And I'm like, all of this is a full-time job. I'm in school 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. and you're telling me I need to be doing more. And it's just, that's what we're taught. So it can be so hard to try to find satisfaction when everyone around us, everything around us is telling us how we need to push ourselves further, do more, and never give ourselves that time to just rest.
Yeah, like that question, what do you do, is so ingrained in the culture, the society, the social infrastructure that we're simply brought up in that if you don't have, a 9 to 5, or like a God forbid a 9 to 9, and you're not working, then therefore your life doesn't have meaning or whatever, which is a totally backwards concept, because there are many aspects of life that can bring meaning outside of a job. A job is inherently designed by definition to provide money so that you can actually enjoy and be able to pay for expenses and whatnot. But that question, what do you do, is so built upon this state of modern, we call ourselves a first world country, but a lot of the ideas are very backwards. And that, what do you do kind of question really exemplifies how, as a society, through capitalism, we're always focusing on how can my job give me meaning versus, how can I really explore that as a person, I have many more dimensions, many more labels, identities that simply one job cannot define.
Exactly. There's so many different aspects to ourselves, to our lives, to where we drive meaning from. It can't all just be wrapped up and focused in one area. Commonly, like you said, it is like our careers and our jobs, the area that we focus in on. But even if you're focusing in on just school or taking care of your home or doing these different aspects, whatever part of your identity you're really just focusing in on one, that's not all of who you are. And it's so important to recognize and make space for all the different pieces of who we are and what makes us unique and what gives us meaning.
Yeah, like a puzzle piece, is in and of itself one part, but there are many different pieces that make up that puzzle, the intricate complexity of who we are. Is simply, I had written a poem like 2 or so weeks about this very idea of complexity, in that, one label is what society likes to do to simplify and speed up that process of understanding who someone is. Like if I tell someone, or like in your situation, you're pursuing a master's in psychology, you can say, in a few years, you say, I have a master's, then someone will be like, oh, like this person has underwent the education, the courses, and therefore, has this title that very easily says, I've already done this and that, therefore, I'm qualified to do such and the other. But in the same way that the label simplifies, I don't have to go through, ask you a lot of questions, make sure watch you do your work. That label really speeds up the process. But at the same time of making that process easier, those labels can also be very detrimental in terms of recognizing people as just one aspect of who they are. like sometimes, that also ties back into the idea of asking, what do you do? If I say like I'm a lawyer, I'm a scientist, that one word, it'll be like, oh, this person has such and such knowledge or tendencies or implications because of that one word. But in reality, that lawyer may like walking his dog on Saturdays, or like did other like painting or doing art or dancing, just a lot of different parts that simply one label just is insufficient and will never be sufficient in identifying who that person is, but also all that they are. And I think simplicity, when tied into the way that mental illnesses are portrayed, unfortunately, one label, whether it's bipolar, schizophrenic, so on and so forth, the list is there. If the label that society likes to say, oh, you're this label, therefore you must have such and such characteristics. But the recovery journey is so different and so unique and also so multifaceted that unfortunately, while beneficial that one label cannot do the job in understanding who someone is.
Yes, labels have a connotation, and some of them have a really great connotation and have this great idea of who you are and who you must be and how knowledgeable and prestige you are. And then there's some labels that have a more negative connotation, not because they should, but because of what society has assigned to it. And like you said, mental illness, mental health conditions have often been assigned a very negative connotation. That means something's wrong with you, you're crazy, you're this, you're that, you're psychotic, you're dangerous, just all these different ideas of who you are without ever getting to know you. And it's so frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this phrase that is provided through the training that the NAMI, or the National Alliance on Mental Illnesses, provides for all their volunteers and organizers. And it's, we see the person first, not the illness. And I absolutely love that concept because throughout my time in serving as sponsorship chair for our NAMI Walks events and being able to interact with the community, that phrase is so true because, like we've talked about, that one label, which in this case would be an illness, whatever that is not defining of who they are because we're too complex to be defined in that way. And so seeing a person first is, I would say, see the person first, not just the label, to expand upon that concept because, we have so many different hobbies, a lot of different parts. Like I for example, I love playing my alto saxophone and just improvising melodies over like freestyle beats is something that I've been recently exploring. And so that would be like one label, right? I'm a saxophonist. And then another one would be like I love drawing, doing shading, or just challenging myself in different ways through art. So that would be, another label, right? You can say like, I'm an artist. So if I go to someone and say, hey, I'm an artist, they'd be like, how are they relative to, Leonardo or Michelangelo and the famous masters of old age. But I have like another thing, just a bunch of different things that I love to do, although some of them, might not be as top tier as say like, Louis Armstrong or whatever, but there are things that I love to do and that I find fulfillment and satisfaction in doing. And I think whenever I approach a situation, whether it's a conversation, someone I've never met, I always have to remind myself sometimes because of what society likes to say that, this person is intricate and very beautiful in their complexity. So therefore, when I approach this conversation, I need to not only be open-minded, but also, even though I may be an expert in my field, that person's an expert in their own lived experience. And they'll have most likely, 99.99% of the time, don't quote me on this for statistics, but that person will have gone through something, learned a lot through that experience that I, just because of my trajectory and the decisions I made, will never encounter that or even begin to understand that. But this other person, what they've lived through, that knowledge or that wisdom for their own lived, experiences can be very insightful and provide another perspective that can be very enriching and humble myself in the way that I can choose to live, because having those multiple perspectives is always essential.
Yes, and I love that phrase that Nami uses, see the person first. And my workbook, I am, the first section is all about this because it's something that I struggled with. And not just from other people kind of looking at the labels around me first when I was in high school was you're a cheerleader, you're a nerd, you're this, you're that, and there's all these just expectations of who you are. But it then became the expectations I had of myself. And those labels defined who I was to me. And that was so difficult. So, like you said, looking at those other pieces, that's what I did in that workbook. That's what I did for myself. I sat down and I made like a little flower, and in every petal, all these different aspects of who I was. I wasn't just a cheerleader. I wasn't just smart. I wasn't just a person living with bipolar 2 disorder. I wasn't just these things. I was, you said, artistic, creative, outspoken, determined, passionate. And
The
it,
affirmations.
yes, the affirmations. I was all these different things, and I could not see it because I even fell victim to the labels of myself.
Yeah, and I love that analogy that you just brought up about the flower and the many petals, because I like to build upon that in saying, each petal can be, one dimension of who you are, who we are. And so, in being, the status of a flower with its petals, if you take a petal away, right, then there's these the remaining petals. And so, it's like saying if I for some, godforsaken reason lose my ability to do one of my talents or one of my hobbies, something that I consider integral to my identity, then I can still do, other things that may gradually fill that gap, because there are many other dimensions that I know and I understand and I appreciate. Because, something that, being creative has a lot of great implications and a lot of great avenues of approach, with drawing, which I know you do through your encouragement cards, which is a great program, and also just other adventures. And so, like, if let's say if for some reason I go through an accident and my left hand gets messed up and I can't draw, but I can still play my saxophone, or I can still write, or I can still do creative writing, and just like other options. And so I think in being multifaceted, just having those options, whether I may be terrible in writing poems, but if I like doing that, like doing the activity is great. If I lose an ability to do something else, I lose that petal, then I'll still have other parts of that flower that still make me who I am, even though that one part may be, you know, lost in some way.
Yes, and new petals can also always grow. Just because you lose one, that's not the end. That is an amazing analogy. I love the way you tied that all together. It is so important. I think one thing I learned throughout my mental health recovery journey was having all these different aspects of coping skills, all these different pieces of a self care routine. Because, like you said, what happens if we can't do one of those things? Or what happens when one of those things just isn't working for us right now? Having those other tools in our toolkit, having those other affirmations, having those other labels or positive words, pieces of who we are available to us is so important because, again, if one isn't available, if one's not working, you need to be able to pull out another.
Yeah, and like coping strategies, coping mechanisms that, an analogy I like to use is like it's a toolbox, right? And if you're a handyman and you have all these projects that happen, right, in your toolbox, you don't just have like a hammer, or you don't have like just a plier, or you don't have just a screwdriver. You have all these different tools, because while you may have an idea of what the project is, you don't know really what will happen as that project happens. And so this handyman has all these different tools, so that whenever the situation happens, that person can pull out different tools to address that situation. And the exact same idea is with coping strategies, and that having a few of them, may not be like 10 or 20 of them, which is like 3 or 5, having the strategy, so that in an event, this strategy may not be the best, but a hammer might not work, but a screwdriver will. So I may not be able to be mindful in a particular situation, but I can may practice diaphragmatic breathing. And so just having different tools in that toolbox is essential, I think, for mental health, even for people who are going through having a mental illness, but even more so for people in general, because those coping mechanisms are so powerful in maintaining that baseline and making sure that you're doing well. You're thriving, you're not just surviving. And although I will say that the terminology coping mechanisms isn't my favorite, I like to use the term resiliency strategies, because that's really what we're doing. We're being resilient, and these are the methods that help in being resilient. And I think coping really implies the way that the word is used and implied through mass media is that you're just, you're existing. You're not enjoying existence, you're just existing. And so resiliency is more so, I've done these things, I've had these satisfactions, I've built like brick by brick, and I'm able to continue to do that because I've done it in the past and I can do it even better in the future. And I also would say that in part of that satisfaction and tying into, resiliency strategies that, I may live in like a middle class home, and the home next to me may be, $1 million home. But at the end of the day, the way that that house is built is the same exact way, section by section, room by room, foundation after foundation, and brick by brick. And so understanding that, of course, this would tie into, comparison is the greatest thief of joy, but in having those coping strategies or resiliency techniques can make sure that, if your house needs a minor tweak or a leak happens, then you can always fix it and you're back, to optimal productivity.
I love that. You are full of amazing like analogies and really helping bring it together in a way people can understand. I mean, I love that the houses are all built in the same way from a solid foundation and build up. You don't start at the top. One person didn't start at the top. We all start in that same place, and they build up at different rates. And sometimes we may need some extra support. One thing may not be working as well. We may be feeling overwhelmed, so many stressors around us. I mean, life is full of so many stressors every single day. And sometimes we need to just pull out a tool from our toolkit and help ourselves move forward, help ourselves get some resiliency strategies or coping skills, however you want to define it, to be able to start moving forward, or reaching out for more support if we can't do it ourselves. Because if there's a plumbing leak, if you can't fix it, you call someone for help. So if it's something that you can't support yourself through, reaching out for help is also extremely important to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that ties directly into, what strengths you have, whatever they are, capitalize the heck out of them. But then the weaknesses, they're just weaknesses. They're opportunities that have been tried, didn't really do that well. So then you know exactly who to call or a friend to ask if a situation requires that particular weakness to be used. And, it just ties back into resiliency. And I would also say, to continue the analogy of architecture, a house, comparatively like a person, that exterior design can be deceiving in many ways, because while the exterior may look polished, trimmed hedges, very nice paved driveway, fancy exterior, but the interior, you don't know unless, you knock on the door and talk to that person. That person lets you in to explore what they've done on the interior. And the same thing is true with, mental health in conversation and in meeting people, in that, it's so easy to judge someone by, their cover. Don't judge a book by its cover is a classic saying, because, in the exterior may look polished, they may carry themselves in a very professional, respected way, but on the interior, no one really knows what's going on unless that person is willing to welcome in someone to actually talk about and discuss and explore, what isn't really commonly exhibited, on the outside. Like I wouldn't, the exterior of my home wouldn't have a toilet in it. It's like things that wouldn't commonly be shown on the outside can only be discovered or found if those conversations and those spaces that are available to have not only conversations, but also vulnerable opportunities, because only in that vulnerability can there be strength, which is a little bit counterintuitive, but also very true, because in only being vulnerable and, opening up about what I've struggled with, not just telling someone what's already on my resume, but talking about things that have given me a tough time that can build much more in the long term than just, how are you doing? I'm doing well. How's your day? It was great. Like things like that.
Yes, 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 yes. And this reminds me of social media and how we're constantly scrolling and seeing people who are kind of polished, put together, living these amazing lives, taking their private jet for a 17-minute flight, doing all of these things that can be so easy to look at and be like, their lives are perfect. They don't deal with these struggles that I'm dealing with. You can't see it. And if they don't let you in the door, they don't talk about it, they don't open up about it, you probably would never know or realize. And it's just so important for us all to recognize what we see on the outside is not always reflective of what's on the inside.
Yeah, absolutely. And those, exteriors tend to be very easily polished because the method that makes them look good is very easy and also very deceptive. And so there's this very classic tendency on social media to, take what we see and then extrapolate very limited data to what that person actually is in terms of how they're doing. And I deleted almost all of my social media because it's just the algorithms that I was being presented with were just at the end of the day not conducive, helpful for my mental health and feeling good. And so, the only social media that I have, if email is social media, which I don't really know, that's a different debate. But I do have a few like social media accounts, but because I know, with my experience as a computer science student, that the way the algorithms are designed is to introduce new content based on what's already interacted. So I have anonymous profiles in the current like day of society with digital technology. What really is anonymous? But I've designed my profiles that I have interests that I plug in, and because I know the way the algorithm works, most of the time I get interests that are highly relevant to me. And that's really the only benefit I see to social media, because like you mentioned, a lot of times very easy to, look, doom scrolling is I think the term, through your feed and just look at people, beach pics, vacation, whatever, fancy jets, extravagant dinners, and then easily assume and extrapolate from that very limited data set that they're, excellent marriage, feeling happy all the time, 100%, which most of the time isn't true. And it's very easy to be deceived in that way, which is, the tendency to judge a book by its cover when you should actually try to interact and find out who that person is beyond like publications or social media posts and very tailored, like manicured putting out of who they are because they design that image in a specific way. And so something that ties directly into that I've been recently doing in terms of understanding more about the nonprofit ecosystem and community is doing a lot of informational interviews with executives for nonprofits, particularly ones that have had like a many multi-year track record. Their tax forms are clean, and it doesn't look sus. And so in doing so, in doing those informational interviews, I get this perspective because I'm asking really, really tough questions to the person who are in leadership about what they've learned through their career, what challenges they've undergone, what things surprise them the most during their career within that leadership. And I understand really peeling back the layers of an onion and really understanding what is this person really about other than just social media posts, very tailored, manicured, like, edited and re-edited photo, like stock photos and although all that PR stunt, which is it's good for promoting that a specific image, but also deceiving in some way in just having that cover when the book itself may or not be hollow.
Yes, exactly. And everyone has a right to post what they want and how they want to. But it's important that we also have a right and a choice of what we take in and we allow ourselves to take in. So, like you said, deleting the apps. we have a choice on whether or not to have the apps on our phone. We have a choice on who to follow. We have a choice on what hashtags to be using and looking up and following. We have all of these choices available to us. And sometimes we forget. I know that
That's too true.
I am so guilty of scrolling for hours on TikTok and like watching all these videos that have nothing to do with my interests. It's just scrolling endlessly until it's 2 a.m. And I'm like, what did I do with my life? But it's just so common to just scroll and scroll and scroll and not do it with intention. And it's up to every single person how they want to take in social media and what content they want to take in. But if you're someone like me who is very easily affected by what you see, who can kind of be hard on themselves, who might have a tendency to compare themselves, pay attention to if you're using any kind of intention when you're opening the apps. That's like the best advice I can ever put out there for our generation. Just making sure you're doing things with some form of intention.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so easy to just sit there after like hours of mind-boggling work, just to sit there and scroll through like, seconds of entertainment on TikTok, which, the very short attention span of that is a totally different topic. But what we just said reminded me of a fascinating study in psychology where um, they did a study really quickly to summarize that they had a child in a room, and in that room there was also like a doll or like an inflatable toy, and so they had a control and the test environment, right? And so in the test environment they had an adult come in, scream, expect, like cursing and whatnot, like hitting the doll, and then like interact with the doll in a very negative way, and then leave, right? And then the kid was like presented before the experience, did like a test or something, and was presented with negative news. And so this kid, having seen this adult do this negative activity, reacts in the same way and in beating up the doll because that child had just seen that. And in the control portion, like there wasn't that the adult coming in and doing that performance, so to speak. And so the child didn't, after receiving that negative news from the the activity or whatever, didn't beat up the doll because he didn't see the the adult come in and do that. And so that idea of having a model, like modeling our behaviors from what we see, is so true with what you just mentioned about being intentional in selecting and knowing what you're consuming, because at the end of the day, even though it may not feel like what is being consumed is actively like consciously used, but affects us in the way that we think and the way that we understand the world because of that content that influences that perception and understanding, even though we're not really consciously aware of it, which is ties into the fact that like a lot of like social media is one part of the mass media ecosystem. The other would be movies, blockbuster movies, Hollywood, and then also television shows. And so understanding that even though this particular cinematography piece is entertaining, sometimes the value in terms of what it impresses on your subconscious uh, isn't that great. And a lot of the it ties directly into mental health and creating these very not decisive but deceiving like images of what body image should be, what is the appropriate amount of violence that should be seen, and stuff like that can directly tie into how we are role modeling ourselves. The content that we choose serves as role models for how we think and how we believe. But understanding that if you're intentional about what content is being consumed, that in the long run, if I may just like watch an hour of Game of Thrones, for example, I may feel like excited because of the drama and whatnot, but in terms of long term, in terms of the amount of violence and drama portrayed, might not be as beneficial. But that being said, anyone is able to choose what they want to consume. That freedom of choice is always there. Just knowing how to make that choice in a way that sometimes watching an hour of Bollywood isn't particularly beneficial long term, but is fun in the moment. Just having that delicate balance is always crucial.
Yes. And it really does affect our behaviors. It affects our thoughts. And that way, that's why when we're listening to it, when we're watching it, kind of setting the perspective for ourselves can also be really important. This is entertainment. This isn't necessarily real life. Even when watching reality shows, and that's supposed to be real life, recognizing that this is for my entertainment. This is not reflective of how I should behave or how I need to behave. And if there's pieces that you want to mimic, go for it. But you don't have to mimic every single piece of someone's behavior or allow yourself to subconsciously kind of take that in and become who you are and affect your personality and your attitude and your beliefs. So you can mimic behavior that you want to, but you don't have to. And having that active choice of intention of what you're taking in, why you're taking it in, and how you're taking it in.
Yeah, what you just said reminded me about two different things. One is that, that definition of choice is ties directly into the feeling of being independent and also being satisfied with your life. Because if I can choose, how I design the environment that I'm in, that ties directly into how happy or how satisfied I may feel. And there's a recent study, I should say, well, recent in psychology, but there's a study where they had individuals who are in like nursing homes, elderly, uh, long-term living facilities, and they allowed them more options to be able to choose from, even though at the end of the day, like the options themselves weren't um, totally monumental, but they were able to choose very specific things. So in the easiest example is like choose what they were able to eat. The menu, like they're given a menu, and so like, oh, you have to eat hamburger for dinner because it's the only thing we have, but they're like given a few different choices from the menu. But then also for the way they're designed room, they could choose where they want their bed, their desk, cabinets, where they want any like decoration, like paintings or posters. They could be able to choose where that is, instead of saying, here's this cookie cutter room. You're not allowed to do anything with it. And so just having those choices was shown in that study that in the long term, those people were very much better off and felt more optimistic. And then also, because in a way they're feeling more optimistic, were able to live longer because of that perspective. And so it just really ties into how the importance of having many options, but also designing an environment where you do have those options and not just inadvertently just putting yourself in a hole. And so I think, in the way that I approach, activities that I do or projects that I'm working on, always leaving room open for multiple options that, even though may feel like not that different, at the end of the day still gets me to my goal. But in the process of undergoing that journey, I feel more satisfied because I feel like I was able to choose more aspects of the project and therefore directly contribute to the outcome of what was going on.
Yes, allowing yourself to be open-minded to the choices around you and allow yourself to explore those options, to present yourself with options. I can do A, B, or C right now. Let me choose what's best for me in this moment. Maybe right now I do need some reality TV. Maybe right now I need to watch some.
Catching up with the Kardashians.
Sometimes I need the Kardashians. Sometimes I need a long walk. Sometimes I need
Yeah, being in
something to
nature.
make me
It's great.
cry. You need different things and giving yourself those choices. I love that, presenting yourself with the different options to you.
Yeah, I was reading this random like parenting blog about how to raise kids. Like I don't have any kids, but I was just randomly like, reading through things, and it was there like there's thing like for a kid, like teaching them to be independent, like raising them in a way so that they can make their own smart choices instead of always being like a helicopter parent. And so one of the things was like very early on, allow your kid to have choices, right? But it's not like you know monumental choices, but they're choices that result in the same destination, but the person who's making that choice feels a lot of independence in doing so. So it's like, the kid has to go to bed before 7, right? But it's like, do you want blue pajamas or red pajamas? And so it's like, yes, this kid is going to be going to bed, but they have the option of choosing something. And that feeling of autonomy really helps in later on, long-term studies that done is feeling more just, together in a way. I don't know if there's any other word that would say just being more together, more independent, and also more decisive and being able to take control and feeling that they have an internal kind of locus of control, like being able to make their own choices and have influence over their environment rather than the other way around.
I really enjoyed that perspective on parenting. Also, not a parent, but as a kid who was not given options, who was kind of told what to do and really guided by my parents, which I appreciate. And I'm not saying it was a bad way to be raised, but I will say that it took a lot of time for me to be able to make a decision. I was that girl who someone asked, "Oh, where do you want to go eat?" And I'm like, "I don't know. I don't make decisions. Like, you figure it out. You let me know." It took me a long time to allow myself to explore what options were available to actually feel confident enough to make a decision. So although I really do appreciate the way I was raised and love my parents, in case you're listening, no, they don't listen, but I appreciate they don't, but I appreciate the way I was raised. I also do wish that I did have that aspect. So I think it's really interesting to see how this kind of maybe shift in parenting where we're allowing kids to start building some kind of independence and building who they are at a young age instead of trying to figure out all of it all at once.
Yeah, I did see like a very short interview with I forget his name, but it's the CEO of the current CEO of Google. And he was like, the interviewer was asking him, how is he raising his kids? And he was like, I'm raising them they have their full own autonomy. There's a different word to use, but it was just in general the idea of, raising them in a way so that, you don't have to hover every single time they're making a decision to check if that's right, but raising them with enough trust and understanding so that, when they are sent out into, the craziness of the world, that the decisions they're making are reflective of the core values that were instilled from a very young age.
I really, really I admire that. And I think no matter how old you are, right now we can start making that active kind of, I don't want to use the word choice because I'm going to use the word choice.
Like independence, freedom of decision. So let me hit up Merriam Dictionary for this chorus.
Actively paying attention to the fact that we often limit ourselves. We don't always give ourselves the opportunity to make a decision. And we may sometimes be around people who make decisions for us and don't give us a chance to have that voice. So actively paying attention to how we can grow ourselves to be more confident in who we are, who we can be, bringing it back to the beginning, not just the label that's given to us, being confident in every aspect of ourselves and our ability to make decisions for ourselves, to move forward and to take care of ourselves and our mental health.
Yeah, and those labels are commonly seen, tying it back together as, something that society gives us, when reality is like you're doing these things, and a result of doing these things, that label is, hey, you check these boxes, therefore you get this label. And so sometimes in being aware of doing things, I may every week attend like a creative writing group, or every other week do different things, or I may play my saxophone in different ways, but doing things repeatedly in a way that you can actually say, hey, society, I'm doing these things, therefore you should give me this label. It's like a flip on what's commonly perceived in that, society is giving me that label, when I can say, I am doing these things, so therefore I can say, I am a speaker, I'm a writer, I'm an artist, or whatever. The other thing I do wanted to mention, the second thing that I said earlier when we were talking about mass media, was that, understanding, yes, what I'm seeing on TV is highly edited, highly scripted, many different takes on the same scene that is then presented as reality TV or different shows. And I think one way that I've found beneficial in kind of breaking down the fourth wall is sometimes, it's very time intensive, but sometimes looking at clips of, behind the scenes with the actors, the scenery and the environment. And sometimes that helps in realizing that, it's all edited. It's all very edited experiences. And, what is reality isn't often what's entertainment, because entertainment, as the name suggests, is designed to entertain. And I think sometimes watching those behind the scenes, or even just like I know there's like a bunch of Facebook groups or whatever that have like behind the scenes clips and videos. So that kind of helps in realizing that, yes, I'm consuming may feel really real, and the emotions that are brought up as I'm watching, but also it's very a composed experience, not improvised happening. And
Yeah.
so and that is absolutely true. And also the only thing other thing I would mention is that we are champions of our own lived experience. And at the end of the day, what happens with interacting with others, different events, different meetings, or whatever, what I have now, what I can say that I've gone so far in terms of my achievements, I can only compare, to where I was a little while before. And that's the best comparison that can happen. And there's a saying, comparison is the greatest thief of joy. But I'd say, that comparison only happens if you're doom scrolling through social media and you're like, oh, this person is like married at X age, has this kid's like whatever job. But really, the best comparison is, where I am now versus where I was a little bit before. And I think mention a quote as we're concluding this is that there's this very famous parable that I read that was really cool and actually resonated a lot with me. And it said that, and it says, I cried because I had no shoes until I met a man who had no feet. And so it's like, even though I may feel like this situation is, utter BS and just totally terrible, sometimes there'll be someone who's a little bit worse off. So although it may not be the most ethical comparison, just understanding, being humble and graceful in what you have, what I have, what I'm able to be blessed to use, having air conditioning in this heat wave of a time, and then tools that I have, being able to have a pen that I can draw with, or even a computer to be able to interact with, and just being grateful in that way. And I found that has been probably one of the most defining contributions to a stronger mental health, and as well as a better approach in understanding that I have these things and I should be grateful for them, because somewhere out there in this world of 7 billion, 8 billion people, there's most definitely someone else who's a little bit worse off than me. So I should always be glad of what I have. And, as the saying goes, count your blessings.
Yes. And that's not to say that it's not okay to feel sad or upset that you don't have something. Those are all normal human emotions.
Yeah, absolutely
And
true too.
you can be grateful and at the same time struggle. So just because someone is better off or worse off, none of that invalidates who you are. Please always remember, those of you listening, who you are can never be invalidated or even validated by someone else. That all comes from you. Davy, you've been an amazing guest today. Thank you so much for joining me. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we hop off?
I just do have one last comment, is that, to say on what you just said, is that, I can be very grateful to have a laptop and internet connection to be able to do this podcast, but also be mad that every few days my Zoom software starts getting buggy and I can't open it and it staggers. So, just whatever happens, you can be grateful for having what you have, but also, have that desire for even more and to continue to, outlive your own expectations.
I love that. Thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Fran. I really appreciate what you're doing with this podcast. And I love all the projects that you're going on, especially the artistic label that you have with the encouragement cards. And those are always great. I know that people who are inpatient will always love those as something to disrupt the monotony of that experience.
Thank you. I promise I did not pay him to say that.
I was not paid
for your support.